Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'm your professor, Randy Kearns, and the topic that I want to cover this afternoon is ethics and legal matters as it relates to disaster and emergency management. So just a couple of highlights I want to be sure and point out. Due this week includes a short quiz related to legal matters and ethics. I think it's 28 questions. You have 50 minutes to complete it. And then there's also one certificate due that's due this week. And it actually deals with recovery, which is our topic for next week. But I also have a separate certificate due next week that's related to continuity of ongoing operations. So one certificate due and one quiz in response to the content that I'll be sure and cover this afternoon. So let me go ahead and get started and talk just a little bit about how we rely on ethics to frame a lot of things that we do in life, but also how it influences some of the decision making that we have to deal with in disaster management and disaster operations. And you know, whether you're a part of an organization or you have a certain credential that maintains a certain professional code of ethics, or it's just a part of who you are personally, we all have ethical boundaries. And I want to talk a little bit about what shapes those. And a part of that is what I've discussed here as the moral community, so to speak. And then there's also legal boundaries. What are the things that we can legally do? What are the things that we're legally bound to do? And then again, the challenge with ethics is, as you can tell by this particular slide, sometimes people don't fully understand what is ethical and what does that mean and what shapes your ethical beliefs. And then how does that influence some of your decision making? And it is curious to, if you think about what influences your ethical thinking, in many cases, there's some type of a religious connotation to it, but there may be some other aspects, whether it's either what your gut is telling you, intuition, or biology, or certain moral argument that may have occurred at some point in your past history that helps inform how you decide in these particular situations as well. And then, of course, there's confinements of legal doctrine. We'll talk a little bit about the legal components later on in the presentation. And then the rationality is really how do we put all of this together. And then again, from an academic discipline or as an applied discipline, the main point about the ethics is how it helps us either deal with the nature of good and bad. When there's choices to be made and there's a relationship as it deals with others or deals with other organizations. There's also an applied and a professional ethics. But again, a part of this gets back to how do you feel about a certain situation, and then how are those feelings shaped or informed by prior experiences or things that you've either seen or understood or heard as a part of past events that may be similar to what you're dealing with now. And then another part of this is to also think about morality in the context of both social norms and mores. And a part of morality also gets back to, again, personal experiences, whether it's innate behavior or biological components or religious beliefs. There's a piece that drives that fundamental right and wrong that we all wrestle with and we all struggle with at times, but the struggle may be different in a pretty dramatic way depending on what your context or your personal experiences may have been. So I've included the teleological ethics, also utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is basically how we achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And the challenge with utilitarianism is sometimes we live in a capitalistic society, and in a capitalistic society, we're far more likely to think in the context of one, me, myself, us, but small numbers. And and while certain organizations may have a moral compass in terms of how they want to provide services for others, there are boundaries because of their business obligations, their capitalistic obligations. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just, again, trying to help you understand the balance between a utilitarian approach and what's, again, seen as more of a capitalistic approach. Um, and again, part of the challenge with capitalism is sometimes we don't always see through the lens of what morality may influence us to do. We see it purely in a binary transactional phase. And in a transactional phase, there's cash items to be bought and sold. Um, and so, again, there are times that as we apply ethics to business dealings or business propositions, it does change the perspective of that. And certainly one of the more profound perspectives introduced into a business society type world is that utilitarian perspective. Other parts of this is so the utilitarian perspective does include certain values that are paramount. But when we talk about values, we're talking about values as it relates to land and environment, and not so much in the context of how much land can I acquire, or in the context of it's more along the lines of being sure the land is available for the greatest good for the greatest number. How much land is available and how can it be appropriately used by the greatest number of people. And again, the whole point to this is perspective, just trying to understand perspective as it relates to ethical boundaries, because as we apply ethics as it relates to a catastrophe, part of that gets back to how do we allocate and distribute resources, what type of unintended consequences may arise. I've got a list here of the public participation, private responsibilities, roles and responsibilities. Having been involved in a number of disaster operations, you would be surprised who steps forward and volunteers and helps. And I think you would also be disappointed in at least some circumstances to know who had an opportunity and chose not to. And it is a struggle. It's a balance, and I understand that. It just, again, a part of this is trying to understand from a legal standpoint, there's a very clear right and wrong of typically what needs to be done. It's typically spelled out in law. But there's a piece beyond that, and the piece beyond that is those ethical boundaries, or those ethical components that, again, people struggle with at times. I remember during the substantial flood involving a hurricane in the Houston area a couple of years ago, one of the very large Christian churches in the area that normally seats well over 1,000 people, I think closer to 5,000 people, chose not to open their doors to refugees, to people who needed to evacuate from their homes. But struggle with, when confronted by public outcry, struggle with defending that position. And again, it gets back to a part of this deals with how much have you thought about in advance, what would you do in a certain circumstance, so that it becomes a lot easier to make a clear-headed decision, so to speak, when confronted with a difficult situation. It's a lot easier to make that decision if you've already made the decision before some of the circumstances arose. And then the applied component of ethics, I have 5 approaches to moral issues. And so let's again look at those. The utilitarian approach is one that is often cited, but not always embraced, and particularly not always embraced in a capitalistic society. There is a balance of how much should we all share in versus how much should you be expected to work for. And so again, that's a part of what's made us the most prosperous country on the planet, is the fact that capitalism has been in abundance and allows people a lot less checks and balances in their ability to earn whatever their potential is to earn. But then the question becomes, how do you treat those with the least among you? And that has been the struggle, and that continues to be a struggle for any society, particularly one as successful as ours. The rights approach, who has rights? What types of rights do they have? The fairness or justice approach. And again, fair is perspective. My idea of what fairness is may be slightly different than your idea of what fairness is. And is there favoritism or discrimination involved? Again, through the lens of today, our view of discrimination is vastly different than 100 years ago. And it's not because they were wrong 100 years ago, but they really lacked the perspective. Well, so yes, it was wrong 100 years ago, but there is a reality of perspective, and that is, I think we have a far better perspective today, and we have a far better understanding today of what people deal with and what people have to deal with. That also provides us with better empathy to help understand how to help other people, particularly people who are less fortunate. And then other aspects of this, the common good and the virtue approach. Again, this common good to some extent ties back to the utilitarianism approach, but the whole point to ethics is to help you develop a viewpoint based on what you understand to be some fundamental right and wrong of things that either you've experienced or you've seen other people experience. You know, their perspectives that I don't have and I never will have. I've never been anything other than exactly who I am. And so for me to somehow suggest that I know what it's like to be a minority, I know what it's like to be a female, I know what it's like to pick something that I'm not. And the reality is I don't know what that's like. And so it's incumbent upon me to try and do more to understand what that's like, and to develop more empathy. And a part of that gets back into, again, what our moral obligations are. And a part of our moral obligations get back to the ethical components of dealing with disaster. Again, understand the plight that people already have. I've mentioned before, it's a lot easier for me to speak to a group of people and talk about their need and how important it is for them to have a supply of food and water and basic food nutrition for 72 to 96 hours, because emergency response may be cut off for a time because of flooding and because of the nature of the disaster. And and again, I've been in some homes where it's very easy for me to talk to you about the importance of having 72 to 96 hours of those things on hand. But I've also, having worked as a paramedic, I've been in every type of household. Um, and it's very clear to me that there are literally millions of people who live in the United States who may have 3 to 5 items in their entire refrigerator, and that does include ketchup and mayonnaise. And the point is, there are families who don't know where their next meal will come from, and so it's very difficult to talk with some people about being prepared for 72 to 96 hours. And from a disaster preparedness standpoint, we also need to have an idea of where those people are who have the greatest need for the greatest amount of help, and to quickly look for ways that we can get help to them. And then so what I just talked about actually gets back into this: how do we apply ethics during a catastrophic response? One of the first ways includes triage, and that's sorting through who needs what types of services. Battlefield triage and medical triage really helps us understand who has the greatest medical needs. I will tell you, having been around, I don't have a military background, although I've worked very closely with several different military agencies. And what I come to realize was their idea of battlefield triage for injured soldiers or Marines was different than our idea of triage in the civilian world. And just a particular example, if people are uninjured in the civilian world, we want to separate them from those who are injured so that we can focus on those who are injured. And we want to move them over to the side, so to speak, so that they're not involved in what we're trying to focus on. In a military world, you're looking for the people who have minimal injuries so that you can re-equip them to put them back into the fight. And again, that's a perspective I don't have, but it does give you a difference between battlefield triage, where you're trying to get soldiers and Marines rearmed and back into the fight, as opposed to that true medical triage of where you're trying to take care of the patients with the greatest number of medical needs. And then legal triage and response triage gets into, again, trying to understand the legal aspects of making certain decisions. And the response triage is how many resources do you have versus how many calls or alarms do you have, and what you need to deal with. So when we're dealing with planning and policy formation, that's a good place for the legal component of this and the ethical component of this to come into effect. What type of community norms exist? Again, when I talk about the norms and mores of a community, it's certainly important to understand that. I have a lot of experience from North Carolina, but the reality is what worked in North Carolina doesn't always work in other states. And in fact, there were certain places in one part of North Carolina, it wouldn't work in another part of North Carolina, having worked in other parts of the states. And so you always have to be mindful of, in terms of policy formation or planning formation, is to start out by understanding the local community norms and mores. And once you understand a little bit more of the local society, it's a lot easier then to look at what may have worked in some other jurisdictions, but what may not work in this jurisdiction because of what you come to know and understand about local operations, how things work. And again, the professional ethics really depends on what type of organization you're a part of. I remember the first time I ever worked in a large university. I was somewhat struck by the fact that the people who most likely taught ethics were lawyers. And having been around some lawyers that I didn't feel were necessarily the most ethical people, I was I was struck by that, but I came to realize, particularly the lawyers that I taught courses with, um, they saw the minimum standard being the legal standard, but then what they applied on top of that was their ethical obligations above and beyond the legal standard. And what I came to understand was that is the way to approach this. And while not everyone does it that way, certainly that is the way to approach it. And then professional ethics exists for most professional organizations. I also worked in a university where we used accountants as well to teach ethics, simply because of some of the ethical training that they had that was part of obtaining their certified public accountant credential. And then it is important to point out that emergency managers, the International Association of Emergency Management, has a code of ethics, and these components again fall on top of the legal obligation. And then there are professional code of ethics, codes of ethics that exist for a number of different organizations, and I belong to multiple organizations. And actually all of which, I think I belong to 6 professional organizations, and each one has some type of code of conduct or code of ethics that's an ingrained part of their organization. And so when we talk about the extent of professional duty, part of this gets back into what are we obligated to do versus what we choose to do. And if we're rendering aid, the most common law that's out there for things that we may choose to do includes the Good Samaritan doctrine. And what that is the Good Samaritan doctrine is a law that exists, and it exists in slightly different forms, but it does exist in all 50 states. But the intent is to provide you with some legal protection as long as you do what is reasonable and prudent for the patient under what would be a normal circumstance, or what a reasonable, prudent layperson would do. Origins of the Good Samaritan doctrine is traced back to the Christian faith. In the New Testament is a book that is entitled Luke. Luke is one of the 4 apostles. Actually, Luke is a physician, so I guess it's only fitting that the story of the Good Samaritan is found in Luke. But it basically talks about someone, a traveler who had been stripped and robbed and beaten and left to die along the side of the road, and someone came along who provided aid. It was a Samaritan that came along, and the Samaritan came upon this Jew and provided aid to this person, and if I'm not mistaken, nursed him back to health. But the whole point to the story was, the aim was to remind you that when you find somebody who has been injured, or who has who's been beaten, or who is things have not gone well for, what is your moral obligation to help them? You know, again, this particular Samaritan could have moved on and not stopped and rendered aid, but because he chose to stop and render aid, you know, that's the basis for the story. It's also the basis for the law that exists, as I say, in all 50 states. There's some basic elements to it. Number one, you don't have any prior knowledge of the event. In other words, you're not there because you're a responder. If I'm there as a member of the fire department, or if I'm there as a paramedic, chances are my pager or some electronic device activated and notified me that this was going on and I needed to respond to it. So Good Samaritan doesn't apply in that situation. But if I don't have prior knowledge, and I don't have a duty to act, and I don't have a duty to rescue, and there are people who, because of their job obligation, they do have a legal duty to act, But if you don't have one and someone is in imminent peril and you're not being compensated for doing this is not your job, so to speak, then you can provide care under the umbrella and the legal protection of the Good Samaritan. You do have an obligation to remain. You do have an obligation to obtain consent. In other words, if someone tells you they don't want your help and they're conscious and capable of making a rational decision, that is consent. You must have consent to be able to continue to provide care. So if someone tells you to leave them, they are denying consent to provide care. But if you consent them, you ask them, can I help you? And they say yes, you do have an obligation to remain until someone arrives who has some type of training to provide additional and ongoing care. If you chose to leave after initiating care, there is a clause that could be raised dealing with abandonment. You do have an obligation to continue that care until someone of equal or higher training does arrive. So obviously, once you initiate patient contact and you start to provide care, you need to remain there and provide patient care until the professionals arrive that can continue the care. And so I've included I'm not going to read this, but I've included the Louisiana version of the Good Samaritan law. It basically covers people who are not licensed to provide health care or some type of medical care. And it specifically talks about someone in good faith and dealing with rendering first aid or rescue at the scene of an emergency. And again, it gets back to that reasonable, prudent layperson. What would somebody else do who's reasonable under the similar circumstances? Let's go ahead and pivot just a little bit into professional codes and talk just a little bit about that, particularly as it relates to journalism. The next piece that we deal with in disaster operations includes dealing with journalists and having been involved in a number of different types of emergency responses. It's like attracting a moth to a light. There's lots of, particularly this day and age, there are lots of people who show up who want to do some type of an interview, or they want to get camera footage from the scene, and so hopefully, and they are bound by certain journalistic ethics, but not everybody there is. There may be people there who are freelancers who make their money off of obtaining images that maybe nobody else can obtain, or obtaining quotes or information that nobody else can obtain, and then they turn around and resell that information. So freelance photographers and freelance videographers often show up and try and collect footage or collect information in a way that may not be considered ethical by say someone that's a representative of WWL TV or one of the local TV stations. So just again, if you're at the scene and a journalist is involved, a part of this is trying to respect their legal boundaries. What type of boundaries do they have to report the news and to obtain information, but also what type of boundaries are there as well in terms of providing appropriate patient care or affecting the rescue or being a part of the, as I say, the disaster response. The media can be helpful though in dealing with a catastrophic response in terms of educating the public. There's such a struggle and such a balance in trying to find the right platform to be able to talk to the public about what's going on. We've been dealing with a pandemic now for more than a year, and there's a lot of people who have what we rather candidly refer to as pandemic fatigue. I'm tired of being told what to do. I'm tired of doing this. I'm tired of doing that. Um, and and the same thing exists with disasters as well. In fact, uh, people who are a part of a disaster earlier in the year are far more likely to get sympathy, to get more action from Congress and from the White House than people who are involved in disasters later on in the year. So if your hurricane started with the letters A through D, E, or F, chances are you're far more likely to get more assistance than if your disaster started with the letters R, S, or T. And as terrible as that sounds, the reality is, again, the fatigue that sets in with some of what goes on. And a part of this gets back to journalism. The challenge with journalism is they have an obligation to inform the community, and they're going to do their best to inform the community, but they also have an obligation to sell media time and to sell ads. And a part of selling ads is to becoming popular. And becoming popular means, you know, you're the TV station people turn to when they want to know what's going on with the news. Well, again, the challenge with that is ethically, how much can you tell and how much should you tell versus, you know, are you there for information or are you there for entertainment? And when it comes to the news, hopefully you're there for information. The reality is, to some extent, you may be there for entertainment as well. Other aspects of ethics in the law, again, is understand the basis for decision making should always be both, you know, what's legal, and then on top of what's legal, what's ethical. And that's that right and wrong that hopefully comes into play when people are making reasonable decisions. We don't have a law that addresses everything. And so because there are gray areas at times, because there are areas that may not be addressed by the law, that is where ethics certainly comes into play. There's ethics also comes into play because the law typically covers just the most foundational item that needs to be addressed. And speaking of the law, let's talk just a little bit about how laws are created in the United States. Whether we're dealing with disaster operations, the most important law there is the Stafford Act, but how do laws come into effect? And so the highest law of the land is the U.S. Constitution, and the Constitution established three branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And then there's another aspect of the Constitution was to separate federal powers from state powers, and left the states with a significant amount of authority within their state to be able to regulate a lot of what goes on within their state. We'll talk a little bit about separation of powers in just a minute in terms of how it relates to both state and federalism. One other aspect of separation of power is also separation of the three branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And to look at each of those, the legislative branch makes laws. Typically, a law will start out in the House of Representatives. If it's passed in the House and it's moved on to the Senate, and the Senate is to review what's been passed in the House and either approve it or reject it, or to make changes to it and send it back. A law does not become law until the same version is passed in the House, it's passed in the Senate, and then that one complete bill is then passed on to the White House for the president's signature. If the president chooses to sign the bill, then the bill becomes law. If the president chooses to reject the bill by veto, then it goes back to the House and the Senate to determine if they can make changes and obtain a 2/3 majority to override the veto. If they can't obtain a 2/3 majority, then they can't override the veto and the bill fails. Once something becomes law, sometimes there are questions about the constitutionality of the law. And if you have standing, meaning you can show that you've been harmed by a new law that was passed, then you can appeal that. And then there are several levels of federal appeals. The most supreme of those levels of federal appeals is the U.S. Supreme Court. But again, you've got three branches of government: the legislative branch, that's the House and the Senate; the executive branch, that's overseen by the president; and the judicial branch, that is includes the federal courts in a number of locations, but ultimately is led by the U.S. Supreme Court. So again, from a legislative standpoint, Congress enacts laws. The executive branch, which is led by the president, and the president, typically the president's political party, their agencies have an obligation to enforce laws and regulations. There are certain things that a president can, with the stroke of a pen, can put into, has the effect of law, and that's called an executive order. Just understand that there's executive order, first of all, can be immediately changed whenever whoever's in the White House changes. As one president leaves and another president comes to the office, those executive orders can quickly be changed. The other aspect of an executive order is an executive order cannot replace a law that's already in place. The only thing an executive order can do is to fill in a gap that may exist that's not addressed by an existing law. If it's already addressed by an existing law, an executive order can't be written to overwrite that law. Anyway, I hope that's clear. Generally, the role of the executive branch is to appoint people to the cabinet, the various cabinet agencies, to enact the law and enforce the laws that have been, to enforce the laws that have been enacted by the legislative branch. That doesn't always work when the legislative branch is controlled by one political party and the executive branch is controlled by another political party. And then the judicial branch, again, there are special courts and district courts, and then ultimately the appellate court, and then finally the Supreme Court. And an example of a special court is there's a tax court. There's those courts exist for resolving certain disputes. And then district court, an example of district court is, let's say, hunting on a federal wildlife reserve. And I shoot something that's out of season, or I don't have a license for it. Because I've done that on federal lands, and the enforcement of that law that I just broke is a federal statute, I'm going to wind up in a federal district court because of that, which is, again, just a reminder that that's a really bad thing to do, or a really bad idea. If I used to live close to Fort Bragg, and Fort Bragg is a very large, sprawling military post. And once you enter one side of Fort Bragg, you may actually drive another 30 miles to get to some of the more active components of the military base. As a civilian, I spent a lot of time on post doing some things, and one of the realities was they had a 50-mile-an-hour speed limit that was enforced by military police. And again, I never got a speeding ticket, but having friends who did, they would wind up in federal district court, which is never a good thing. Again, if you wind up with a speeding ticket, you want to be in some type of local court, not federal district court. But there are a number of different types of laws that exist. One particular component, actually, let me get over here. One particular component is something called stare decisis, and that basically means if it's been decided a certain way in the past, then if this question has come up before, then that's what we're going to continue to do. And where that exists, first of all, that exists in 49 states. And stare decisis, again, is based on, again, just consistency in how the law is applied. And the reason that I mention that is Louisiana is the only state where stare decisis is not an obligation of a Louisiana judge. A Louisiana judge can rule based on their own interpretation of the law. And while they tend to follow, again, stare decisis, and what stare decisis really means is, the best example is, how many times have you asked to do something from involving your spouse or a parent, and you've been told the same answer, 10 times. And at some point you don't ask the question again because you get the same answer. And the whole point to stare decisis is to be sure people get the same answer for the same question. Again, where that is slightly different is here in Louisiana, where judges can rule based on how they interpret the law, which doesn't always comply with what we know of as the stare decisis. Anyway, and then types of state courts, appellate, superior, district, and magistrate court. The most common local court is magistrate court. District court also exists at a local level. And then superior court, there is superior court here locally, but that's only because it's the superior court for a much larger region. And then actually the Supreme Court for Louisiana is actually located in New Orleans. After the state capital moved to Baton Rouge, I think in the 1870s, the Louisiana State Supreme Court chose to remain in New Orleans. And then what's criminal versus what's civil? Crimes are considered offenses against the state, and civil matters are between people. And why that's different is, again, with criminal decisions, you're more likely to wind up being fined by the state, or you may wind up having to serve time for the state, or providing community service for the state. But with a criminal conviction is between you and the state. A civil issue is between two people, and a civil issue may be divorce. A civil issue may be suing your neighbor over where they put a fence post. Civil matters are heard in civil court, and criminal matters are heard in criminal court. Civil matters, if you do wind up with a jury for a civil matter, it's a majority rule as opposed to a preponderance of the evidence unanimous rule. So and again, a majority of criminal decisions never go before a jury. Although if we watch enough late night TV or evening TV, we see all of this courtroom drama play out. The reality is, if you ever wind up in a courtroom, that process is typically very quick. Even local district court is very quick. And the point is, there's a long-standing docket that they need to go through, and there's not the typical seating a jury and back and forth unless it's a substantial criminal case or a substantial civil case. Constitutional rights, particularly as they relate to a disaster and disaster operation, due process in the 14th Amendment is huge. It's also important to recognize that the U.S. Constitution is not suspended during time of crisis. Rights are protected during time of crisis. Now, and I say that actually during the American Civil War, habeas corpus was suspended by President Lincoln. He was challenged by Congress, and it some point they chose to set that aside. But again, just to put things in perspective, during the Lincoln administration, executive order was the Emancipation Proclamation. That was not passed by Congress, and in fact, that was in violation of the U.S. Constitution at that time. But his caveat was, as he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, he targeted only those territories or states that were in rebellion against the United States of America. The Emancipation Proclamation did not cover those areas where slavery existed but was not in rebellion. Kentucky as an example, Maryland as an example. So during time of war, and certainly during the American Civil War, there were a number of times that constitutional rights were challenged, and during time of war and conflict is probably when there's more question about constitutionality than most of the time. But it is important to recognize that no president has a right to suspend the Constitution. Now, they may try to take executive action, but there are places that when they try to take executive action, it will be based on those, again, those caveats, those nuanced areas that aren't necessarily as clear-cut and as protected. Let's see. The Posse Comitatus Act, the reason that's important, the reason that I put this in here, this law was passed in June of 1876 during the Hayes administration, and the whole purpose of this, the Hayes-Tyndall election of 1876 left a lot of dispute, and in fact, Louisiana was a part of that dispute as to whether Tyndall should have won the election or Hayes should have won the election, so much so that they appointed a special commission that included members of the House, members of the Senate, and members of the U.S. Supreme Court. And they came to a conclusion that they would reject electoral votes from one particular state. I think it was either Virginia or Missouri, but in exchange for that, they would withdraw federal troops that were occupying southern states. And an ongoing continuance of that was to take troops out of the role of law enforcement. And so the reality to that is, and the reality today is, the U.S. military, the Army, the Marines, have very little law enforcement authority within the confines of the United States. Their obligation is to defend and protect, but they're typically seen as a part of either a declaration of war or armed military conflict, and that's not to be perpetrated against other citizens of the United States. So that's more of a police action and more of a police state. And again, the Posse Comitatus Act is based on the fact that was written to withdraw troops and to tell military forces that you do not generally have a law enforcement obligation in the confines of the United States. Let's see. The 14th Amendment is, we can't deprive somebody of life, liberty, or property without due process, substantive and procedural. Supreme Court action. This is important as it relates to vaccination. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the authority of the states to enforce compulsory vaccination laws. That was a 7-2 decision. Now, that was more than 100 years ago, but Jacobson versus Massachusetts is the most recent Supreme Court decision as it relates to states having the power to force people to be vaccinated. And the law does exist, and the Supreme Court action does exist that supports that. Other things that have changed, particularly over the last 50 years, the Civil Rights Act, Americans with Disabilities Act came into being about 1992. The Rehabilitation Act and Age Discrimination Act. Again, those pieces are important to understand application of federal law and application of federal disaster assistance. And then again, back to the executive order component, based on protecting vulnerable populations. And I've got pictures of President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, all signing executive orders. They're common, and again, they have the force of a law, but they can only exist in the void between what's already been defined in the law and what's not been defined. So if it's not been defined by a law, then executive order can take effect. But if there's already a law that exists that was passed by Congress and signed by the president, an executive order cannot be written to override that. And then on an international basis, there are international health regulations and international human rights laws. And then a piece of this includes minimum standards for disaster response, and then what type of interagency activities will take place. Minimum standards in a disaster response, right to water, food, shelter, and health. I do find it interesting that one of the 4 basic rights, even at an international level, includes the right to health, which seems to be an ongoing debate in the United States, dealing with how much of healthcare is a right versus how much of healthcare is a personal choice. And then dimensions of the moral community, the biological, the temporal, and the geographical. How do we provide aid? What type of protection for future generations? And then how much of the biological dimension, people, animals, other living things, are we doing to provide care? Again, the myth and the reality, disasters don't pick which neighborhood that they affect, but because of who's more likely to live marginally in an at-risk environment, the poor and the marginalized are far more at risk for the impact of a disaster. As we've seen with the pandemic, there were a lot more people that were living paycheck to paycheck who had, less than $100 in the bank at the time the pandemic struck, than those who had the means and the wherewithal to be able to absorb part of the blow dealt by the pandemic. And again, we've only seen that exacerbated during the pandemic. There are a number of factors that increase social vulnerability. And again, a part of that gets back to what are we doing to help others? What's both our legal obligation, but certainly our ethical obligation as well. And then social inequity from disaster to catastrophe. There is significant inequity that exists, and a part of understanding policy and population security includes what are the things that we can do to minimize, particularly those with the least, and reduce what their risk and what their impact is in population security. So let's kind of summarize it this way. Catastrophes and disasters provide substantial ethical dilemmas. There are a lot of laws that support response and the activities of assisting a community in the aftermath of a disaster. But a part of it does come down to that fundamental right and wrong. What are we going to do and how do we do it? I don't think disasters necessarily pick communities that they affect, but it is very safe to say that people who live close to the edge on a regular basis, simply because they, if you're earning $8 an hour or $10 an hour, it is very difficult to do anything more than just exist. And when all you can do is just exist, you're living very close to the edge all the time in your life. And so the impact from a disaster for that person is far different than the impact for someone who can financially afford a blow, at least for a short period of time. And so again, a part of our obligation is to also look for and to be aware of what are the communities most likely to be impacted, and then how do we help those, how do we help everyone, but how do we focus on those who have the greatest needs? And with that, I'll wrap it up and say, appreciate your time today. If you have questions, send me an email. Again, our assignments this week include a quiz and a single certificate, and that'll be it. Otherwise, let's kind of wrap it up this way. And here we go. That's what I'm looking for. Okay. Until next week, hope you have a good day. Bye.